I have often been asked to write my life, as those who knew me know that it has been an eventful one. Much has been omitted, but nothing has been exaggerated.
In 1868, Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly published an autobiography entitled Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. Her book provided insight into the life of an African-American woman born into slavery before the Civil War, a woman who endured horrific treatment, yet rose above it all to purchase her freedom, establish a successful business, and become the confidant to the First Lady of the United States. This is her story, in her words, of life behind the scenes during a tumultuous time in American history.
I was born a slave, was a child of slave parents. Therefore I came upon the earth free in godlike thought, but fettered in action. My birthplace was Dinwiddie Courthouse in Virginia.
When Elizabeth Lizzie Hobbs was born in February 1818, her mother Agnes Aggie Hobbs was enslaved in the household of Colonel Armistead Burwell. A veteran of the War of 1812, Colonel Burwell's roots went deep in Virginia. Aggie, a skilled house servant, acted as nurse to the Burwell children and was married to a man named George Hobbs, who was enslaved in the household of a nearby planter. She had given her daughter Lizzie George Hobbs's last name, but it is widely thought that she was in fact the biological daughter of Colonel Burwell. Being born of the master did not afford Lizzie much special treatment. Perhaps the only advantage she received was being taught to read and write. At a time when it was illegal in many places to educate a slave, the fact that Aggie, Lizzie, and George Hobbs were all literate was unusual. Except for her literacy, however, Lizzie was not treated differently. Her duties and punishments as an enslaved person began at the age of 4.
While living at Hampton-Sydney College, Mrs. Mary Burwell gave birth to a daughter, my earliest and fondest pet. To take care of this baby was my first duty. True, I was but a child myself, only 4 years old, but then I had been raised in a hearty school.
Lizzie was proud of her position in the house and the little white apron she wore, but after an unfortunate incident when the baby fell out of the crib, Lizzie was whipped severely.
This was the first time I was punished in this cruel way, but not the last.
As the years passed, Lizzie continued to work for the family, doing various tasks including sweeping the yard, household chores, and sewing, which she learned from her mother. But soon she would find herself in a new situation, being lent out to another family member many miles away from her home.
When I was about 14 years old, I went to live with my master's eldest son, Robert, a Presbyterian minister. His salary was small, and he was burdened with a helpless wife, a girl that he had married in the humble walks of life. She was morbidly sensitive and imagined that I regarded her with contemptuous feelings because she was of poor parentage. I was their only servant, and a gracious loan at that.
Robert Burwell had married a young woman from Petersburg, Virginia, named Margaret Anna Robertson, who at 22 was only 8 years older than Lizzie. Known as Anna, she descended from colonial governor Alexander Spotswood and was raised by her aunt Bott. Anna was well educated at home and physically imposing at nearly 6 feet tall, but she struggled early on managing the demands of home and children. Anna often worked alongside Lizzie, but was also quick to chastise and berate her.
From the very first, I did the work of 3 servants, and yet I was scolded and regarded with distrust. The years passed slowly, and I continued to serve them. At the same time, I grew into a strong, healthy womanhood. I was repeatedly told, when even 14 years old, that I would never be worth my salt.
4 years after Lizzie came to work in the household of Robert and Anna, Robert accepted a call to a church in North Carolina, moving his family from Virginia. Lizzie was forced to leave behind everything she had known and everyone who had cared for her.
I was nearly 18 when we removed from Virginia to Hillsborough, North Carolina, where Mr. Burwell took charge of a church.
Little is known of the society Lizzie Hobbs may have had access to in Hillsborough as an enslaved woman. She did form relationships with people in town, serving as an attendant in several local weddings. Even with these potential friends, she was still very lonely being far from her family in Virginia. 2 years after arriving in Hillsborough, Lizzie wrote home to her mother expressing how she felt about her distant relations.
I want to hear of the family at home very much indeed. I really believe you and all the family have forgotten me. I love you all dearly, although I may never see you again.
When the Burwells arrived in Hillsborough in late 1835, the town was small but thriving, with numerous businesses and a variety of residents, ranging from lawyers and doctors to tradesmen and craftsmen, including free people of color. The family moved into a home owned by the church and attempted to survive on Robert's annual salary of $400. That challenge grew too great, and just over a year after arriving in Hillsborough, Anna opened a school for young ladies to bring in much-needed funds. With several young children of her own, the requirements of a minister's wife and a school to run, she likely found herself overwhelmed by responsibility. It seems clear that Anna felt anxious in her new setting, and she took her anxiety out on the easiest target available, Lizzie.
She whom I call mistress seemed to be desirous to wreak vengeance on me for something.
As was often the case with slave owners of the time, it was thought that a strong spirit in an enslaved person was something that needed subduing, and that was frequently accomplished by physical force. It seems that Anna Burwell felt physical force was necessary in the case of Lizzie, and she enlisted the help of parishioner, neighbor, and schoolmaster William Bingham to assist with this task. The Burwells loaned Lizzie to the Binghams, and while she was there, William acted on the request of his neighbors, ordering Lizzie into his study and unexpectedly beating her with a lash.
Mr. Bingham had pledged himself to Mrs. Burwell to subdue what he called my stubborn pride. Oh God, I can feel the torture now, the terrible, excruciating agony of those moments. My spirit rebelled against the unjustness that had been inflicted upon me, and though I tried to smother my anger and to forgive those who had been so cruel to me, it was impossible.
These beatings continued for a time, but eventually Mr. Bingham could no longer stomach the torture.
Mr. Bingham again tried to conquer me, but in vain. As I stood bleeding before him, he burst into tears and declared that it would be a sin to beat me any more. My suffering at last subdued his hard heart. He asked my forgiveness and afterwards was an altered man. He was never known to strike one of his servants from that day forward.
Unfortunately, though Mr. Bingham had a change of heart, Anna and Robert still felt Lizzie needed to be subdued.
When Mr. Bingham refused to whip me any more, Mr. Burwell, he who preached love of heaven, was urged by his wife to punish me himself. One morning he attempted to conquer me. At the sight of my bleeding form, his wife fell upon her knees and begged him to desist. My distress even touched her cold, jealous heart. The Reverend Mr. Burwell was not yet satisfied. He resolved to make another attempt to subdue my proud, rebellious spirit. Made the attempt and again failed. When he told me with an air of penitence that he should never strike me another blow, and faithfully, he kept his word.
Had Lizzie's torment stopped there, it would have been bad enough, but in addition to the beatings, she endured pain and humiliation of another type.
The savage efforts to subdue my pride were not the only things that brought me suffering and deep mortification during my residence at Hillsborough. I was regarded as fair-looking for one of my race, and for 4 years a white man, I spare the world his name, had base designs upon me. Suffice it to say that he persecuted me for 4 years, and I became a mother, the child of which he was the father and the only child that I ever brought into this world.
Though Lizzie did not mention his name, the assumed father of her son was a prominent local white man named Alexander Kirkland. He was married, a father of 2 young children, and came from a wealthy family in the area. Kirkland's pursuit of Lizzie would not have been an uncommon practice. It is likely the Burwells were aware of this continued sexual assault, but no Burwell records survive to document their thoughts and feelings. Lizzie had never wanted children. She could not bear the thought of bringing a child into the world enslaved, but that choice was taken from her by the actions of others.
Why should my son be held in slavery? He came into the world through no will of mine, and yet God only knows how I loved him. By the laws of God and nature, as interpreted by man, one half of my boy was free, and why should not this fair birthright of freedom remove the curse from the other half, raise it into the bright, joyous sunshine of liberty?
Though she longed for freedom for herself and her child, it would be many years before either enjoyed the sunshine of liberty.
My troubles in North Carolina were brought to an end by my unexpected return in 1841 to Virginia, where I lived with Mr. Garland, who had married Miss Anne Burwell, one of my old master's daughters.
Hugh Garland was trained as a lawyer, but struggled financially. He moved his family, including Lizzie, her mother Aggie, and son George, from Virginia to St. Louis, Missouri, hoping for a better life. Despite the move, the family's fortune did not improve, and it was suggested that they hire Aggie out to make money. It was a common custom of the times for slave owners to allow others to rent their slaves for cash payment. Lizzie was devastated by this idea. Her mother had raised the Burwell children, was devoted to the family, and had never known anything else. Lizzie asked Mr. Garland to allow her to find another way to make money for the family, and he consented. Her skills as a seamstress and dress designer had developed through the years, and in St. Louis she was able to use these skills to not only help the Garland family, but also start on the path to securing her own freedom.
I was fortunate in obtaining work, and in a short time I had acquired something of a reputation as a seamstress and dressmaker. The best ladies in St. Louis were my patrons, and with my needle I kept bread in the mouths of 17 persons for 2 years and 5 months.
It was during her time in St. Louis that Lizzie's relationship with her future husband, James Keckly, progressed. James presented himself as a free man of color when she met him in Virginia, but Lizzie would not consent to marry him while she remained enslaved. When her owner, Mr. Garland, finally agreed to consider her request to purchase freedom for herself and her son, Lizzie consented to marrying Keckly while she was still enslaved. So in 1851, at the age of 34, Elizabeth Hobbs married James Keckly.
Taking a prospective glance at liberty, I consented to marry. The wedding was a great event in the family. Mr. Garland gave me away. That day was a happy one, but it faded all too soon. Mr. Keckly, let me speak kindly of his faults, proved dissipated and a burden instead of a helpmate. More than all, I learned that he was a slave instead of a free man, as he represented himself to be. With the simple explanation that I lived with him 8 years, let charity draw around him the mantle of silence.
During the years of her marriage, Mrs. Keckly began working in earnest to earn the money required to purchase her freedom. In return for her loyalty to the family, the Garlands asked $1,200 for her and her son, which in modern funds amounts to more than $30,000. Because Mrs. Keckly was still working to support the Garland family, it was difficult to save much toward her goal. One of her patrons knew of her plight and pledged to help her raise the money.
The $1,200 were raised, and at last my son and myself were free. Free, free. What a glorious ring to the word free. The bitter heart struggle was over. Free. The soul could go out to heaven and to God with no chains to clog its flight or pull it down. Free. The earth wore a brighter look, and the very stars seemed to sing with joy. Yes, free. Free by the laws of man and the smile of God, and heaven bless them who made it so.
Mrs. Keckly's 1855 Emancipation Papers, signed by Mrs. Anne Garland, describe Lizzie as being about 37 years of age and by trade a dressmaker. Her son George, about 16 years of age, is described as almost white. Freedom was at hand, but before she would feel truly unfettered, Mrs. Keckly was determined to pay back every cent of the money that was loaned to her. She worked herself to near exhaustion, and with the debt finally repaid, she was ready to make a change. With her emancipation papers in hand and having dissolved her unsuccessful marriage, Mrs. Keckly headed east to Baltimore. After an unproductive few weeks trying to start her dressmaking business there, she decided instead to establish herself in Washington, D.C.
I left Baltimore with scarcely money enough to pay my fare to Washington. Arriving in the capital, I sought and obtained work at $2.50 per day. I rented apartments in a good locality and soon had a good run of custom. During my residence in the capital, I made my home with Mr. and Mrs. Walker Lewis, people of my own race, and friends in the truest sense of the word.
Mrs. Keckly began acquiring customers for her modiste, or dressmaker services, from among the wives of senators, congressmen, and other highly placed officials. In a short time, she had established herself as a prominent crafter of fashion and had a thriving business.
Learning that Mrs. Davis, wife of Senator Jefferson Davis, wanted a modiste, I presented myself and was employed by her.
Jefferson Davis was a senator from Mississippi who moved in the political circles favoring Southern secession from the Union over the issue of slavery. Davis would go on to become the President of the Confederate States of America.
The prospects of war were freely discussed in my presence by Mr. and Mrs. Davis and their friends.
Mrs. Keckly found herself closely associated with high-profile individuals, but she wasn't content with making dresses for senators' wives. After turning down an offer to accompany the Davis family south at the beginning of the Civil War, she set her sights on achieving a long-held personal goal: to take her business all the way to the White House.
Ever since arriving in Washington, I had a great desire to work for the ladies of the White House, and to accomplish this end, I was ready to make almost any sacrifice consistent with propriety.
The day after President Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated, Elizabeth Keckly became the dressmaker for his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln. She interacted with the family, was called Madam Elizabeth by President Lincoln, and attended them through numerous private family moments, including the death of their son, Willie. Keckly's own son, George, had been attending college at Wilberforce in Ohio, but he left school in 1861 to enter the Union Army.
George went to the battlefield with 3 months' troops and was killed in Missouri. Found his grave on the battlefield where the gallant General Lyon fell. It was a sad blow to me.
While grieving the death of her child, as well as working to build her business as a dressmaker, Mrs. Keckly also helped found and served as president of the Contraband Relief Association. Enslaved individuals who had escaped were often referred to as contraband, and the Relief Society's goal was to help emancipated individuals start new lives. Mrs. Keckly corresponded with and worked alongside many prominent individuals during the era of Reconstruction, including Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and Harriet Jacobs. On April 15, 1865, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. A shock to the country, it was especially hard on his wife, Mary. In her grief, she asked those around her to "Send for Elizabeth Keckly. I want her just as soon as she can be brought here." Mrs. Keckly had become more than just a dressmaker. She was indeed a confidant and consoler to the Lincoln family. After the assassination, the Lincoln family returned to Illinois, and Mrs. Keckly maintained her close relationship with Mrs. Lincoln. Keckly continued to operate her business in Washington, D.C., but in 1868 she agreed to close up shop and accompany Mrs. Lincoln to New York. The former First Lady was heavily in debt and was attempting to sell some of her clothing in New York to pay off what she owed.
I knew that Mrs. Lincoln's income was small, and also knew that she had many valuable dresses packed away in boxes and trunks. I thought that since her need was urgent, it would be well enough to dispose of them quietly. She was the wife of Abraham Lincoln, the man who had done so much for my race. so I consented to render her all the assistance in my power.
This attempt became known as the Old Clothes Scandal, and did little to help Mrs. Lincoln financially or in the public eye, where she was regularly vilified by the newspapers. Mrs. Lincoln was always seen as slightly improper for the time, seeking publicity, spending money lavishly, and responding to the death of her children and husband with strong emotions. During Mrs. Keckly's time in New York, she began writing her autobiography. The book tells the story of her life, and at the time of publication was intended to help rehabilitate Mrs. Lincoln's reputation, as well as sustain her own.
My own character, as well as the character of Mrs. Lincoln, is at stake, since I have been intimately associated with that lady in the most eventful periods of her life. To defend myself, I must defend the lady that I have served.
Though Mrs. Keckly had the best of intentions, reactions to her book were less than favorable. Not only did the press respond negatively, the publication also fractured the relationship between Keckly and the Lincoln family. Beyond the text itself, the inclusion of personal letters between Mrs. Keckly and Mrs. Lincoln, which the publisher insisted on including, seemed to the family to be a betrayal of their trust and an intrusion into their private lives. This is not the outcome Keckly had anticipated.
I have written nothing that can place Mrs. Lincoln in a worse light before the world than the light in which she now stands. If I have betrayed confidence in anything I have published, it has been to place Mrs. Lincoln in a better light before the world.
Following the publication of her book in 1868, Elizabeth Keckly continued to work for many years. She joined the faculty at the historically black Wilberforce University as the head of the Department of Sewing and Domestic Service. After suffering a stroke in the late 1890s, she returned to Washington, D.C., reduced her workload, and regularly attended the 15th Street Presbyterian Church. Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly died in 1907 at the age of 89 and was buried in Columbian Harmony Cemetery in Washington, D.C. The cemetery was moved in 1959, and the graves were incorporated into National Harmony Memorial Park in Landover, Maryland. Keckly's minister, Francis Grimke, described her as a very remarkable woman, a commanding figure, of unusual intelligence, a woman who thoroughly respected herself. Elizabeth Hobbs Keckly lived an inspirational life. In spite of all the trials and sorrows she faced, Keckly secured her freedom from slavery, was a successful businesswoman, and, with her autobiography, left a lasting historical record of a significant time in American history. She influenced the lives of many through her humanitarian efforts and never gave up, working for the betterment of herself and others until the end.